So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining Heart Support Australia's Heart Support Connect, our first one for 2023. My name's Christian Verdicchio. I'm the new Chief Executive Officer for Heart Support Australia. And given my background as a clinical academic, it made a lot of sense to me and the team to put me up first to give a presentation on a very topical area at the moment in relation to atrial fibrillation, and in particular how we treat atrial fibrillation now in terms of exercise and risk factor management. I do have an extensive background in terms of research and clinical work in cardiovascular disease in Australia and internationally. At the present moment, I still hold academic appointments at the University of Sydney and the University of Adelaide, in conjunction with being an executive member for the Cardiac Society in Australia and New Zealand, Allied Health, Science and Technology Council, and also still currently the youth or the young ambassador Australia for the European Society of Cardiology, Preventive Cardiology branch. So very heavily involved in cardiovascular disease and very happy to be a part of the Heart Support Australia team now, trying to improve our peer support services across our network in Australia and increase our services as well in terms of our volume and our reach. So without further ado, I will get started. I'll give a brief background, and Dana, correct if there's any issues. I trust everyone can see my screen here. Is that correct? Yeah, great, awesome. Everyone's on mute. That's how we like it. So Heart Support Australia, just as a brief introduction, is the peak national body supporting Australians affected by heart disease through peer support. We are a national consumer body providing support, encouragement and education to heart disease patients and their families. Our vision is to stop secondary cardiac events and improve the lives of those living with heart disease in Australia. And like any organisation, our mission is to facilitate the transition from hospital to home and provide ongoing support for heart disease patients in Australia with a real particular attention to regional Australia. And it's where we're at the moment harnessing our efforts in terms of increasing our peer support group network in the regional areas. Just for some information, at the moment, Heart Support Australia has currently 13 peer support groups, and we are currently under development and with consultations with another 13 locations across the country. And as you can see there in the blue, this is where we're currently looking at developing new areas with a particular focus in Northern Territory, South Australia and Tasmania. Also because of the reason that we actually don't have any groups in there at the present moment, but I am happy to say that we will have a group in South Australia and the Barossa Valley kick off in April of this year. So probably another 6 to 8 weeks away before that group actually starts. I'm actually currently working with the local cardiac rehab team there and the new peer support group leader to start some of the promotional work to actually get that group going. For anything information around Heart Support Australia, we have updated our website. It is a central part in terms of getting information from us. So please go online, check our website, www.heartsupport.org.au, or feel free to look us up on Facebook, where we provide regular posts in terms of the activities that we're doing, notifications around peer support group meeting activities, and also we are available and on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. So without further ado, I do have some disclosures here to nominate, but I think it would be good to get started now. So cardiovascular disease in Australia is the leading cause of death, and 1 in 6 Australians are affected by cardiovascular disease. And approximately every 12 minutes, an Australian does die from cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of hospitalizations and does increase yearly by around 2.2%. Men over the age of 55 with 2 or more cardiovascular disease risk factors are 6 times more likely to die from cardiovascular disease by the age of 80 than compared to those with 1 or no risk factor. And for women having 2 or more risk factors over the age of 55, you are 3 times more likely to die from cardiovascular disease by the age of 80 compared to those with 1 or no risk factors. So risk factors do play a key part, and it becomes a numbers game in terms of predicting your risk of a cardiac event or cardiac diagnosis in the future. I know this graph's a bit tricky, and I am a clinical academic, so I want to actually keep it to actually something quite interesting. But this was a 20-year study that we did in our group back in South Australia, and we were looking at cardiac hospitalizations over a 20-year period between 1993 to 2013, and we looked at all the Medicare hospitalization data. And what we found over this 20-year period is that in the blue bar, heart failure admissions increased by around 40% in terms of those coming to hospital for a primary diagnosis for heart failure. Those who were having heart attacks over this 20-year period increased by around 73% in the green bars, and you can see those green bars coming up nicely up here. But what we kind of didn't realize, and we always suspected, but is now the case, is that a 300% increase in atrial fibrillation admissions actually took place over that 23-year period. And what you would find is actually from this point here in 2011, the orange chart is actually higher than the other two, which actually means that the AF admissions became the #1 leading cause of cardiac hospitalizations in the country. And so this is actually an underrepresentation, because people with atrial fibrillation need to be diagnosed as AF in a primary sense. Secondary, tertiary diagnosis weren't actually included in the study. And a lot of people with atrial fibrillation tend to actually probably get maybe missed as well. They may not be in AF, they may have had some dizziness, they may have had some fainting, fatigue and shortness of breath that actually may have not actually been picked up in the hospital setting. So we actually believe this is actually an underrepresentation. So very big, in term burden in Australia. When we're talking about cardiovascular disease risk factors, I'll start on the left here in terms of what we call non-modifiable risk factors. We can't change our age, we can't change our gender. Well, actually, you can do that these days, but you can't change your genetic factors. You can't change who your parents are and your grandparents. And we can't change our background either, where we originate from, European, are we African, North American, or South American. And so these are what we call non-modifiable risk factors. What we can change and what we typically talk about are modifiable based risk factors. So, having hypertension or high blood pressure, smoking, having diabetes, particularly type 2 diabetes, that's what this refers to, being physically inactive, not walking, not exercising, not doing much around the house, being overweight or obese, having high blood cholesterol. And obviously that's 7 that I'm talking about there now. This graph also actually fails to miss high levels of alcohol consumption as well, which is another cardiovascular disease risk factor. So when we start to think about, okay, what are the numbers looking at in terms of what are the odds of actually having developing a form of cardiovascular disease? If you're a betting person, age, gender, genetic risk factors, perhaps 1 or 2. But when you start to add the other 5, 6, 7, 8 lifestyle-based risk factors that we can modify, we can actually control in our arms, what is the biggest number that's actually going to really serve you the most purpose? And then I always like to talk about this graph because as a clinician researcher, I was a clinician, still am to a degree. It was very easy for patients who came into your clinics, who came into your classes. I set up Australia's largest private cardiac rehab program. So I saw a lot of patients coming through cardiac rehabilitation, spoke to them on a regular basis across my hospital group. It was very easy for them to say, oh, my father had a heart attack, my grandfather had a heart attack, that was the reason why. But these people who would say that to me were typically obese, they smoked, or they didn't smoke, they didn't exercise, they had diabetes, they had high blood pressure, they had sleep apnea that they weren't actually treating. And all of a sudden you start to get the picture that, well, hang on a second, there are 5 or 6 uncontrolled risk factors that you have there that you've done nothing to do but except worsen because of your lifestyle choices. But we pick the one risk factor that we can't change whatsoever. And so if you actually think about the numbers, is one risk factor, more powerful than 6? I don't think so. So it becomes a numbers game. So it's all about trying to make the best long-term outcomes for you and give you the best chances and the best risk, probabilities in actually, minimizing your chances of developing a form of cardiovascular disease, or actually giving you best secondary outcome measures well if you do have cardiovascular disease. So let's go to atrial fibrillation, I guess, which is the topic around tonight. So AF, or atrial fibrillation, which I'll refer to tonight, is the most common sustained cardiac arrhythmia in the world, which affects around about 2% of the global population. There is a growing prevalence of AF worldwide, and in Australia, like I showed you in the previous couple of slides, is now the leading cause of cardiac-related hospitalizations in the country, surpassing both that of heart failure and heart attacks. It's an electrical disturbance of the heart caused by abnormal electrical signals within the upper chambers of the heart, which we call the atria, which result in the atria to contract in an outer rhythm or irregular fashion, and it can lead to a rapid and irregular heartbeat. Typically, patients with atrial fibrillation have a broad range of symptoms. They can feel palpitations, they can be dizzy, shortness of breath, fatigue, exercise intolerance, so their ability to actually exercise is quite low. I had a friend of mine who just thought, as he was progressing in his sporting career, that his age was catching up with him. It actually turned out he actually had atrial fibrillation, which was the cause of his exercise tolerance actually reducing over a period of time. So these are quite common symptoms, really, when you think about it. And we would say to anybody, especially over the age of 50, 55, with the risk factors that I'll talk about shortly, should go and get screened for atrial fibrillation, because the reality is you are more likely not to actually have atrial fibrillation when you go looking for it. And the other part is that with atrial fibrillation, there's also significant increased risk of having a stroke or developing heart failure. So there's a reason why we really want to get on top of this. With about 40% of strokes actually caused by underlying atrial fibrillation in the first place. So it's a big player in terms of stroke. So what is atrial fibrillation? For all of you medical experts out there, or consumers and patients, I think it's always a good thing to put these images out there, because we all know a little bit more, especially if we're suffering from it and all the experiences that we're going through. So the top chambers here of the heart, we have the atria. And what they do normally, that you would get an electrical impulse that would come from the upper right chamber of the atria called the sinus node, and that would propagate an electrical pathway down to the atrioventricular node, or the AV node. And then that pathway will then continue all the way down through the ventricles, and you get this nice regularity in terms of the ECG trace at the bottom of this diagram here. With atrial fibrillation, in the upper chambers of the heart, there are electrical signals coming from all other places where they shouldn't be. And what happens is that actually starts to override the electrical signals that come into that middle part of the heart, where we call the AV node. And so you start to get this irregular rhythm, as you can see here on the right. And the heart actually doesn't really contract to its full capacity. It can have a full contraction, it can have a half contraction, it can have a 3/4 of a contraction. Because of the fact that the electrical signals are coming in at irregular time points, the heart actually doesn't really have the ability to actually fully contract and pump out all the blood at the time that it should be the case. So this is what we class as atrial fibrillation. There are 4 types of atrial fibrillation that we class. We start from the top here in terms of what we call paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. So episodes that, typically self-terminate on their own. People can have these type of episodes. I'm going to put a laser pointer here, and have these type of episodes that are quite short. They can last for 30 seconds, they can last for a minute, and they can go away on their own. And they terminate spontaneously, and it's not a problem. Persistent atrial fibrillation is what we call that atrial fibrillation episodes that start to last more than 7 days. They don't terminate on their own, and they need something to actually terminate it. So whether that is you going into hospital and they're giving you some type of pharmacological therapy in terms of reverting you back to a normal rhythm, they give you something called a cardioversion, where it's pretty much like it is an electrical shock on the heart to shock it back to a normal rhythm. And that's what we class as persistent atrial fibrillation. Then we have other things that we call long-standing persistent, where this is where people are having atrial fibrillation ongoing. It's not resolving for a whole range of reasons. And obviously there is still the strategy to try and get you back to a normal rhythm. It is not dangerous to live in an irregular heart rhythm. That is fine. It's actually okay. If you do have an irregular heart rhythm and people know that you have atrial fibrillation, Obviously, medication therapy is important to, one, reduce your risk of stroke, which I spoke about previously as well because of the stroke risk. And two, we just want to make sure that you don't have a high abnormal heart rate because, people with atrial fibrillation can have rapid heart rates. So we do try and also call something rate control therapy, where we try and reduce your heart rate and keep it within a normal level. But having an irregular heart rhythm is actually technically still safe. Then the last one we call permanent atrial fibrillation. This is a technical term where we would say to a patient that you have permanent atrial fibrillation when the cardiologist, in conjunction with the patient, decide that they no longer wish to actually try to bring the patient back to a normal rhythm, that they decide that atrial fibrillation is going to be permanent. They're always going to be in atrial fibrillation. They're no longer going to try what we call a rhythm control strategy. That is to try and bring it back to a normal rhythm, most likely because the attempts have been unsuccessful, and it's decided that we'll stop these attempts. No need for any more cardioversions or other type of treatments like ablations. You will live in having atrial fibrillation, but you'll be appropriately medicated to ensure that you have your stroke risk reduced through blood thinners, and also we're trying to keep your heart rate down to a decent level and not too high. So these are the four classes of atrial fibrillation. What causes AF? Well, there are several causes that cause structural, electrical, and autonomic changes to the heart. And these are really the typical cardiovascular disease risk factors. It's obesity, it's being overweight and having that high amounts of adipose tissue within our surrounding organs, and in particular our heart, which infiltrate the heart. It's hypertension, it's obstructive sleep apnea, type 2 diabetes, hyperlipidemia, not being physically active, and that's physical inactivity. That's not even talking about exercise, having high levels of alcohol intake, and being smoking. So there are there are about 8 significant risk factors here that all play a part and change the way the atria or the heart functions, promoting the arrhythmia. And if we look here and this was some work that also came out of our group in Adelaide over a 20-year period. If we look here in terms of if you have no risk factors, your likelihood of developing atrial fibrillation over a 20-year period is quite low. If you have one risk factor, it comes up higher, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So what you can see here, there's an exponential increase in your risk of developing atrial fibrillation over a 10 to 20-year period by having more of these, what we call lifestyle-based risk factors. It is well known now that these risk factors are the contributing cause of having atrial fibrillation, and that they should be assessed and treated very aggressively, which I'll talk about more in a second going on. So how's atrial fibrillation managed? Like I said, it does vary. There's basically 2 strategies that we call rate or rhythm control. So like I said, rate control refers to the treatment to manage the heart rate. So we won't want the heart rate too high, 80 beats per minute, 100 beats per minute, 120 beats per minute. We want the heart rate to be below 90 beats per minute. My apologies, I have my little baby running around in the background, which I'm sure you're probably hearing. So, and look, it is fine to actually, try and keep the heart rates within these normal limits. And obviously, it's by keeping them in the normal limits, it's trying to actually prevent the development of heart failure in the long term. We got something also called rhythm control, and I think in the term you can actually catch what I'm trying to say here. Rhythm control refers to the treatment to actually try and restore the heart rhythm back to a normal rhythm. And we call a normal rhythm sinus rhythm. Okay, and this can be done through drugs or medications. This can be done through a direct current cardioversion where they shock the heart, or a catheter ablation where they actually go in and we cauterize, burn. We actually identify where the electrical signals are coming from in the upper parts of the heart where they shouldn't be coming from, and we burn those electrical pathways so they can no longer actually propagate electrical pathways anymore, and that signal is then ceased. The other thing that's also important, like I said, is anticoagulation, because as we know, AF patients have a 5 times increased risk in having stroke. So it's very important that a cardiologist, physician really assesses what is the best treatment strategy that a patient undergoes for their individual needs. So what's risk factor management? Risk factor management for atrial fibrillation is now really the 4th pillar of treating atrial fibrillation. I spoke about rate control, spoke about rhythm control, spoke about anticoagulation. But risk factor management is now the fourth pillar of treatment, because the link between lifestyle-based risk factors and AF is now well established. So we actually now know, based on our studies back in Adelaide, that our two significant studies, which was called the ARREST study and the Legacy study, showed that there was a significant improvement in cardiac function and structure, reductions in the symptoms of atrial fibrillation, and the reduction in the time in atrial fibrillation. And there's also a high chance of achieving freedom from atrial fibrillation as well in those patients who lost more than 10% of an initial body weight or targeted a BMI less than 27, exercised aerobically for 30 minutes a day as a target, were screened for sleep apnea and were treated appropriately for that through CPAP therapy, which is sleep apnea is a very big one. And I recommend that if any of you have any concerns of sleep apnea, you or your partner have any type of snoring or fatigue or anything like that, please go get screened. It is a big player in heart disease. Aggressively treating blood pressure, not saying that, okay, we're okay with a high blood pressure around 145 or 90 or 140. No. We aggressively treated blood pressure to get it below 130 because, any elevation of these risk factors are a negative towards the heart. So we aggressively try to bring all these identified risk factors of the patient back to within normal levels. And then what we found that there was a reversal of the atrial fibrillation. Same thing with blood sugar levels, control and monitor the blood sugar levels if they're pre-diabetic or diabetics. And obviously we aim to reduce their weekly alcohol consumption to less than 3 standard drinks per week. So this had significant implications in terms of treating atrial fibrillation. And what we found was that, and bear with me here, we think about over a 4-year follow-up period. In the red, these are the patients who lost more than 10% of their initial body weight. In the purple, those were who didn't lose any type of body weight. And what this graph is ultimately showing that over a 4-year period here at the bottom, what was how many of them remained free from atrial fibrillation without needing medication or interventions such as an ablation. And those who lost the most amount of weight, about 50 to nearly 60% of them were free from atrial fibrillation at a 4-year period without the need of an ablation or without the need of medication, compared to only 18%. So that was a 3-fold difference between the two groups and very significant. So it showed that through reducing weight by aggressively targeting risk factors, you can actually be free from atrial fibrillation without the need of actually having these type of interventions. If you add in the interventions, if you needed an ablation, if you needed a cardioversion, if you needed medications, those who lost 10% body weight, nearly 90% of them were free from atrial fibrillation at 4-year follow-up, compared to only 40%. So it actually showed that still, if you need the treatment, which is important, we're not saying that this is going to be something that stops surgeries and stops medications or anything like that. But if you still need those treatments are more likely to be successful, and you're more likely to reverse back into a normal rhythm if you're doing the right thing by also targeting the underlying cause of the arrhythmia in the first place, which was the weight, which was the blood pressure, which was the sleep apnea. And by doing the right thing, your chances of having no atrial fibrillation in the long term was significantly increased. When we look at atrial fibrillation, and again, bear with me here and I'll explain this with you. Atrial fibrillation, like I said, there were 4 types of atrial fibrillation. We start from paroxysmal, short episodes, they self-terminate. And if left untouched, untreated, unmanaged, atrial fibrillation becomes more progressive. From short episodes, maybe lasting a minute or 2, they become a bit longer, they become more frequent. They're no longer able to actually self-terminate. And so now you're actually forced to go into a hospital and get it terminated through a cardioversion or an ablation or something like that, or a rhythm control strategy. So it is very common to see people progress from paroxysmal to persistent forms of atrial fibrillation. What we wanted to show you here, that in the orange, in the groups, but again, lost more than 10% of their initial body weight, only 3% of those people actually progressed to a more progressive form of atrial fibrillation. However, that group that didn't lose the weights or who lost less than 3% or gained weights, 48% of them progressed to a more long-term form of atrial fibrillation. So it actually shows a really distinct picture here that if left untreated, if not actually targeting the underlying risk factors in the first place, you are more likely to progress to a more permanent form of atrial fibrillation. And on the flip side, if you do the right thing, you are more likely to reverse. 88% of patients who lost more than 10% of their initial body weight reversed from a persistent form of atrial fibrillation to a paroxysmal to having no atrial fibrillation at all. And only 26% of the patients who didn't lose weight or gained weight actually had a reversal of the atrial fibrillation classification. So this really tells a picture. This shows now that atrial fibrillation can be reversed. You can go down the classification list and go backwards instead of progressing upwards that we typically see with these AF patients. And the reason for is because we're actually targeting the underlying reason in the first place. Alcohol is another one too. I know I put up a lot of these graphs, but I'm hoping I'm explaining it so people understand. But this was only a 6-month study. It was supposed to be 12 months, but unfortunately, getting people to stop drinking alcohol wasn't achievable for 12 months. So they cut it short at 6 months. But nonetheless, they still found a significant outcome at the end of the study. This was done in Melbourne in John Cowman's group, a very prominent electrophysiologist. And so what they did was patients underwent ablation therapy. And then they put the patients who underwent the ablation therapy into 2 groups. They got the control group to continue on with their weekly or daily alcohol intake, which they averaged for the week, if I recall from the study, around 14 standard drinks for the week. So it's about 2 nights. The abstinence group were told to actually cut alcohol or actually reduce it down to less than 3 standard drinks per week. And what they found, the abstinence group averaged about 2.5 standard drinks a week. So they were well within that less than 3 standard drinks per week area. At 6 months, 50% of the patients who cut out alcohol and did the right thing were free from atrial fibrillation compared to only 25%. So what we found here that there was a 2-fold difference between the groups, and this was significant just after 6 months. So what we actually were able to see is that alcohol alone is an independent player in terms of being a risk for atrial fibrillation to develop, and also being a risk for progressing atrial fibrillation if you already have it in the first place. So this was actually also important to note that this was independent of weight loss. This was independent of sleep, treating sleep apnea and all those type of other risk factors that we would typically also see in this patient cohort. So this was a really promising study that only at 6 months, there was already a 2-fold difference between groups just by reducing the alcohol intake. So this really adds some more information how lifestyle does play an important part in treating atrial fibrillation. This is messy. I was thinking about taking it out, but I wanted to show you something. We think here, this is what we call the electrical mapping of the heart, in particular the atria. So we can see where all the electrical signals are coming from. Think of blue and purple are good. Red and gray is bad. So if we look in a normal heart on the top here, control heart, it's good. A lot of areas are blue, a lot of areas are purple, and very little areas are red. It's quite normal, healthy heart or atria, what we'll say. When we look at the diseased heart, things change. So let's think of aging. We now know atrial fibrillation over the age of 55, it is a risk factor. Aging can cause, more redness or this, disease type of atria, which is a risk factor. Hypertension, a lot more redness, a lot more areas of, what we call low voltage, which is not good. Heart failure, bit more, the gray areas are areas of what we call scarring. Sleep apnea, we couldn't see it from this angle, but when you reverse it on the other angle, significant areas of red, no good. So what we're able to show here, that while sometimes we may not know the symptoms, we may not have the palpitation, we may not have the dizziness, actually we may not even have the irregular heart rhythm yet, but underlyingly in the actual atria itself, there is changes to the heart happening. And think about the analogy of an iceberg, where you have a tip of the iceberg that sticks out of the ocean. but what underneath the iceberg took many, many years to build up before it finally pops out. This is the same logic that we go about in terms of treating atrial fibrillation. Aging, hypertension, sleep apnea, obesity is not in this one, but it is. These all make long-term underlying changes to the atria, which are bad for the heart. There's a lot of areas of red and purple here that shouldn't be there. And there's only a matter of time before these changes result in the patient actually having an episode. And so what we actually know now, that we've seen in other studies, that these areas of redness and purple, this redness and yellow, what we don't like, can actually reverse through weight loss, can actually reverse through doing the risk factor management. So we actually know now that these changes to the heart, whilst they're bad, are also reversible. And so it does give hope that we can actually improve the underlying structure, the underlying physiological functioning of the heart in the first place. So let's talk about exercise and physical activity from also the perspective to prevent atrial fibrillation. So this was a study, if you recognize the second name of that person on that study, I'm sure you will have a look in a second. This was a study that we did 2 years ago now that we published with our group back in Adelaide, where we got 15 studies. We call it a meta-analysis, which is pretty much identifying all the studies in an area, and you analyze each of the studies together and you pull all the patients and the results. And so what we looked at was self-reported physical activity and the risk of developing atrial fibrillation. So ultimately had 15 studies, nearly 1.5 million participants in terms of data. We had a follow-up period of around 4 to 20 years. And what we found is that there was a significant reduction in developing atrial fibrillation by around 11% for those who were having higher levels of physical activity on a weekly basis. So in actual fact, it works out that if you're doing moderate levels of walking for about 30 minutes a day, which is a really good level, so around that 210 minutes per week is where we're now promoting in terms of our weekly exercise and physical activity levels, there was 11% reduction in terms of developing atrial fibrillation. So we know that physical activity, exercise, can protect you or reduce your chances of developing the arrhythmia in the first place independently. When we look at exercise and physical activity to treat atrial fibrillation, again, this was a study done from our group back in Adelaide. This cardiologist, Rajiv Patek's actually now based in Canberra and heading up the heart rhythm unit there. And so this is a 4-year study, and this was only an observational study. So just follow me here. So in the orange, after we did a whole bunch of exercise tests at the beginning, and we got people assessed and doing an exercise test. At 4-year period, we reassessed them again. We did the exercise test. And we quantified patients in terms of those who improved the levels of cardiorespiratory fitness by a technical term that we call a MET or 2 METs. Okay, I don't really have to explain it, but it was a technical term to define cardiorespiratory fitness. And ultimately, those patients who improved the cardiorespiratory fitness by 2 METs over a 4-year follow-up period, 60% of those people were free from atrial fibrillation without the need of an ablation or medication, compared to only 20% who didn't improve their fitness. So then what we then looked at was, okay, what else improved in these patients at the same time? And so we saw that their weight also came down, that improved the fitness levels. Their blood pressure also came down. Their antihypertensive medication reduced. Their diabetes markers significantly improved. Their insulin levels improved. Their triglycerides and LDL levels, those on lipids, medication significantly improved. And also inflammatory markers significantly improved as well. So there were so many positives for these patients who actually improved their cardiorespiratory fitness over this 4-year period. And so then it kind of then started begging the question, because this was an observational study, well, what happens if we actually do a study and see the outcomes from there? So that was a 4-year basic observational study. So, we just watched the patients over a 4-year period. This study here came out in 2016. This was a 12-week study. I don't really have to go into much of details, but ultimately the control group in the blue were those ones that are doing nothing. The ones in the red, they were doing exercise 3 times a week for 12 weeks. And these patients were assessed and daily. They had what they call a cardiac monitor implanted in their chest to actually assess their rhythm all the time. And just from a 12-week exercise intervention, they were able to show that the amounts of atrial fibrillation in the patients who exercised in the group, who in the exercise group 3 times per week, they reduced their total time in atrial fibrillation by around 3.3%. It was only after 12 weeks. This was live, they have ongoing data analysis in terms of what rhythm they're in, whether in a normal rhythm, whether in atrial fibrillation. And the control group increased the amount of time they were in atrial fibrillation by 4.4%. So if you think about it from a time perspective, if someone was having 2 hours on AF on average, then that time went up by 4.5%. So that's something around having 2 hours and 25 minutes of atrial fibrillation now on average, compared to having an hour and 30 or something like that in terms of reduction. So just figuratively speaking. So we saw just from a 12-week basic exercise intervention, this was enough to actually reduce the amount of time in atrial fibrillation. The patients reported improvements in symptoms. They didn't feel it as much if they were in atrial fibrillation. They felt better from it. And the cardiorespiratory fitness levels improved, as we would expect as well from the exercise group, which is an important thing, because if you improve your fitness levels, you feel better, and we actually know you live longer as well. So it has a mortality benefit, like we say. So what next then after that one? Well, next after that, and again, if you recognize one of the authors, the second author on that title there, I don't like to big note myself. But this was actually just published 2 months ago. So this was actually my PhD paper, which I'm quite happy with. And Adrian was my PhD supervisor. And I started this study back in 2015. That's how long ago it took. So it was a 4-year study. So these things aren't easy to get up and running them over a period of time. And so what we wanted to look at was actually getting patients randomized into an exercise intervention. So patients came in, they were randomized to either what we say control group or an exercise group. If they'll put into the exercise groups for the first 3 months, they were coming in weekly for a supervised exercise visit by myself. And after 3 months, the 3 to 6 month mark, those visits turned to fortnightly. Those sessions were done with myself either on a treadmill, on a bike, on a rower, and something that we call high intensity interval training, which you may or may not know. It's a form of exercise training where we push people at a higher intensity, and we work you harder for around 4 minutes at a high intensity. You then have a break for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we repeat that again another 4 times. And so ultimately you work very hard for a total of 16 minutes. And that 16 minutes of high intensity exercise, where you're working at a very the upper limit of your heart's capacity, has significant benefits to your heart function, your heart health, and your general health as well. And actually, the patients are actually quite capable of doing it. In actual fact, all cardiovascular disease patients are quite capable of doing it. So we don't have to be so conservative in our exercise approaches to patients with heart disease. And ultimately, on top of that, patients were really pushed to achieve 30 minutes of exercise a day, so 210 minutes per week. And the control group, they had some basic information at the start, and they came back after 6 months to redo the test again. And then we followed them up another 6 months after that. So there was, baseline, the exercise intervention was for 6 months. We retested them at 6 months again, and then we followed them up after 6 months after that to see how they were going after they finished with the exercise intervention. And so after that, what we found was that after a 12-month period, there was a 2-fold improvement in the patients in the blue, in the exercise group, being free from atrial fibrillation. In fact, 40% of the patients after 12 months were free from atrial fibrillation, compared to only 20% in relation to those in the control group, or the group that didn't undergo the exercise therapies. What's important to note as well is that this study was independent of weight loss. So the patients didn't lose weight, very rarely, but nothing significant. This was purely driven by improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness levels. They improved in their fitness levels, and as a result of that, we saw a reduction in the amounts of atrial fibrillation they were having. This was a positive study. This is a very significant study, and it's actually the largest study to date in this field. The previous paper that I spoke to you about, that was a 12-week intervention, so 3 months, was obviously shorter in duration, and it only had 50 patients. This had 120. So we were, much, two and a half times the size, much longer follow-up period, and really trying to assess the outcomes long term. So we saw a reduction in the atrial fibrillation. When we think about their symptoms, okay, so exercise is the blue group, control group is the red. This is at the baseline. When they come in and they report how they feel in terms of the AF symptoms and their severity, was fairly matched. They felt the same, which we would expect at baseline. Then we give them an intervention, and at 6 months, at the end of the intervention, the exercise group reported significantly better symptom severity scores. They felt much better. They didn't feel the AF as much compared to the control group. And then when we followed them up at the 12-month mark, it got even better. So in actual fact, the symptoms for the exercise group were far better at 12 months compared to the control group. So this really showed that not only did we see a reduction in the time of atrial fibrillation, we also saw patients feeling better from as a result of the atrial fibrillation as well, because knowing that episodes can still be short in nature and terminate on their own. So they could still have some time in atrial fibrillation, but how they felt when they had the atrial fibrillation was better. They felt more comfortable. They felt that they could still do things around the house. They didn't feel that all of a sudden, oh, I've got an AF episode, I need to sit down, I need to get worried, I need to get scared, I can't do anything. They felt quite comfortable with that. And that's a significant important thing, because AF is actually is a condition that you can actually live with. So in conclusion from the study, we found that patients with atrial fibrillation, a 6-month exercise and physical activity intervention improved AF freedom off antiarrhythmic medication and without the need for an AF ablation. It reduced the AF symptom severity, so that their self-reported symptom scores. It improved their cardiopulmonary fitness levels, but it didn't impact on their blood pressure, BMI, or other measures of cardiac functioning. So this was purely just exercise driven. So if we were to add weight loss, if we think about all the tools in the chest that I was talking about, weight loss, alcohol reduction, controlling hypertension, getting on top of sleep apnea through CPAP therapy, you now add exercise intervention in that, you're now giving yourself the biggest chance to actually reverse and manage and treat your atrial fibrillation condition in the long term. And so exercise training is safe. It should be recommended in AF patients, and it's really key now to actually, their treatment strategy moving forward. What are the reasons for this? This is, a pretty straightforward diagram, but, we know that improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness can help with blood pressure control, can help with the electrical signaling between the brain and the heart. So that's a very important factor. We know that there's improvements in the heart function, and obviously even the sizing of the heart as a result of exercise. We know that there's improvement in glycemic control, or diabetes management, I could say, to make it easier. There's a reduction in visceral fat, so we can get a reduction in the amount of adipose tissue around the surrounding organs, which is the worst place to have it, because it actually can infiltrate our organs or our heart tissue, which causes fibrosis. So that's not a good thing. And also we know that exercise can reduce inflammatory markers as well, and oxidative stress. So this is actually a positive thing. So directly or indirectly, there are benefits through exercise, how it plays on the body's various systems at play, and how we get that improvement in the long term. And so ultimately, from a recommendation point of view, exercise is key for prevention, in terms of preventing atrial fibrillation, but it's also key in terms of treating atrial fibrillation too, and it shouldn't be shied away, and it is very safe in this population cohort. We should be ultimately trying to achieve 30 minutes a day of aerobic exercise and targeting 210 minutes per week. And so on that note, if you think about what I've basically said today, this is our diagram or our model that we call in terms of aggressive risk factor management. We start with the pillars: weight management, exercise, trying to target 10% initial body weight loss or a BMI less than 27. Trying to get that exercise up regularly. We say start at 30 minutes for 3 to 4 times per week, increase that up, ideally to 250, but we say 210. Get on top of your, blood lipid levels, screen for sleep apnea, take your CPAP therapy, get on top of your blood pressure, do a blood pressure diary, take your blood pressure daily or twice a day, see how it's going, try and get it down or below 130/80. Get on top of your diabetes blood sugars, stopping smoking and reducing your alcohol intake to less than 3 standard drinks per week. This is what we call aggressive risk factor management. It's not risk factor management, it is aggressive risk factor management, because we are being aggressive to get those levels or those individual risk factors down to a normal, healthier level. And so you already have a heart disease condition, you already have a diseased heart. It's not appropriate to keep all these individual risk factors in the abnormal ranges. We need to get them in the healthy ranges, because that's where we can see the long-term benefit on the heart, and obviously the reversal and the improvements in terms of the atrial fibrillation outcomes in the long term. And so in terms of information, I just took this out of what we call the guidelines. So this is the Heart Foundation and Cardiac Society guidelines, which were produced in 2018. There should be some updated ones coming this year. But the grade strength of recommendation, assessing risk factors and treating them, strong. Intensive weight management, targeting body mass less than 27 or body weight of 10%, strong. Screening and management of sleep apnea, strong. Exercise that improves aerobic capacity, strong. All these things I said today are highly recommended, strong recommendations from the Heart Foundation and Cardiac Society position statement in 2018. What I'm saying to you today is not wishy-washy stuff. This is guideline-driven treatment strategies for people with atrial fibrillation. So in summary, from today's talk, high levels of exercise and physical activity reduces the risk of developing atrial fibrillation. AF is a lifestyle disease that is reversible through attending to a patient's lifestyle-based risk factors. And risk factor management is now essential to improve a patient's long-term AF outcomes by actually targeting the source that promotes the arrhythmia in the first place. Improvements in fitness has shown to reduce AF recurrences and improve symptoms. High intensity and moderate intensity exercises are safe and beneficial in patients with atrial fibrillation, and both strategies can be used to get the best benefits for these patients. The greatest benefit seen in those patients who try and target more than 210 minutes per week of exercise, so 30 minutes a day. And any level of weight loss, exercise, or physical activity is beneficial no matter the baseline functional level of the patient. So it should be promoted no matter what. Any loss or any improvement is a positive thing at the end of the day. And I always like to say that AF patients should be referred to cardiac rehab programs or peer support groups to understand the importance to control modifiable-based risk factors and partake in regular exercise. Unfortunately, atrial fibrillation patients, for some reason, still seem to be not referred into these type of programs, thinking that they don't fit in the usual coronary artery disease patients, because we know that coronary artery disease patients typically have heart attacks because of risk factors, and AF is kind of seen as that electrical condition. The natural fact this electrical condition is actually caused by lifestyle-based risk factors as well, and actually patients have significant benefits from actually attending to their risk factors. So it should be promoted. It is very key to the long-term outcomes, and I cannot stress it enough. So to finish off with my presentation, I always do like this slide. I think it captures it nicely around lifestyle. But I think it's all fair to say that what message I'm trying to push here. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today, and I am happy to answer and take any of your questions.
Hi, it's Kate McCarthy, Catherine McCarthy.
Oh, yes. How are you going?
Yeah, it's been very interesting listening to what you have. I couldn't write fast enough with all the points that you put down.
Not a problem.
I was told I had developed AF a few years ago, but when I was diagnosed with it, I was a high level active person. People at the gym at my age, in my late 60s, they used to say to me I was a machine. I could outdo all the youngsters in the team. I was really, and my diet was very good, but I've still got, and my weight's fine, and I still got AF. So how come that?
Look, it's anything can still happen. Like I say, there's still genetic risk factors that come and play. We, at the end of the day, in any of these things that we say, it's always a numbers game. Here, my video's back up. It's always a numbers game. we try and do everything we can to reduce your risk of developing atrial fibrillation or managing the AF in the first place. If you are still unfortunate enough to, develop atrial fibrillation, even by doing the right thing, or even those patients, let me talk about heart attack patients, where I've had patients have heart attacks and they're very physically active, they're fit, they're healthy, have a healthy weight. But you're more likely that when you have AF and you have all those other risk factors in a healthy range and you're quite healthy and active and those, your AF outcomes are more likely to be positive. You can handle it better. You won't be affected from your day-to-day type of living. You have less levels of fatigue and all those type of things. So unfortunately, you got it. But, like I say, it's a numbers game. If you try and do all the right, it's like trying to win the lottery. The more and more tickets, the more and more tickets you buy, the more and more likely you're to win it. But you can just buy the one ticket and win it. So it's just one of those things. It comes down to numbers. And we always say, and cardiologists think like that, a lot of health practitioners think like that, cardiac nurses think. It's all about trying to give you the best odds long term. The best odds to prevent something from happening. If you're still unfortunate that it happens, then you've got the best odds that you're going to have better outcomes in the long term. That's not going to affect you as much.
Oh, well, I can only hope.
I'm sure you will. We've had positive outcomes with patients with atrial fibrillation. And, I can only stress that, physical activity, exercise, all those type of exercises and those day-to-day things are highly recommended and highly beneficial to you.
I don't drink alcohol. I have a very, very good diet. My weight's right, so I don't know what else I'm going to do. But anyway, that's fine. Thank you very much. I found it very, very interesting.
No worries. You're welcome. Any others? I think I had a hand up from somebody. I'm happy to take that question. If you just want to unmute yourself, please jump in.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? I'm Debbie.
Yes,
my husband is in the background here. He's watching as well. He's had.
Sorry?
You there?
Debbie.
Who am I talking
to? Debbie.
Debbie. All right.
Tierney.
Perfect.
Hi there. So for the last 22 odd years, my husband has had AF. Unfortunately, it's progressed for the worse. And he is with me. He's watching. He's here now. He's just out of camera. He's had 3 ablations. Unfortunately, have not been successful. He's also got flutter now as well, atrial flutter, which was tried to be fixed at the last ablation back in November. But he was also diagnosed with severe heart failure. Yep. So we've got a huge, and he's also got complete left bundle branch block as well. So, I mean, we've been watching with interest. He's always been as fit as he can be, active person, basically until last year when everything just came tumbling down in regards to his heart failure. So it's great to see, the recommendations for the exercise, and which he has been doing. He's had a very active job. Unfortunately, the AF has got the worst of him. Is there anything else we can do?
How old is he?
He's 55.
Okay, so he's young. Look, I can't speak exactly because every case is unique and things. And look, I know, like I said, it always comes down to a numbers type of game. You try and do the right things by targeting the risk factors at play, which is causing in the first place. And, if you're having them controlled and treated appropriately, it all helps. Like I say, on the graphs that I showed you, I never said that, it was 100% of patients that were treated atrial fibrillation. So, but more likely than not. However, the hard part is that, sometimes it's just the way it goes, and all we can recommend and stress, stress to people like yourself is, trying to remain physically active as possible, trying to, especially weight and sleep apnea, if you have it, the CPAP therapy is important. to try and, do as much as possible to actually really negate some of the side effects associated with the worsening of the condition.
He has. He's the last 22 years ago he stopped smoking, which was
Oh, good.
great. He's of course on zero alcohol now, whereas before we were just moderate drinkers. So as far as his weight goes, he's got a BMI of 27. Way less than
Look,
that now. Yeah.
It's a hard one. I mean, I've got a close friend of mine who's had 4 ablations, fit, active.
How many can you have? How many can you have?
I've heard a few more. You wouldn't want to go too many times because you can scar and can scar the tissue. But it's obviously something that's weighed up by the cardiologist or the electrophysiologist. It's not my, I can't comment. It's one of those hard ones to discuss. But always getting a second opinion, perhaps, if you're key. One thing I always do stress, is that I worked in a group, and I still do for my research purposes, in a group that specialise in atrial fibrillation and heart failure. So there are cardiologists, which are termed electrophysiologists, which specialise in patients purely with atrial fibrillation, and sometimes getting a second opinion from them, if you haven't had that opinion, can make a bit of a difference as well, because all they do is see people with atrial fibrillation, and that's their bread and butter. So I always recommend that to a lot of my patients that talk about maybe being unsuccessful with ablations. They maybe want a second opinion, and as consumers, you're rightly entitled to do so, and you're well allowed to go and see what other people have to say in terms of the situation that you're in. But unfortunately, that's all I can say at the moment. So apologies.
Is there anything we were looking at, perhaps thinking of maybe a pacemaker? Would that? Again,
I can't comment. It could be indicated based on your husband's underlying condition because of the left frontal branch block and perhaps the worsening of the heart failure. But I can't comment on that without, and it's also not my area. So as well. So by trade, I'm not a cardiologist by trade. So I won't be able to comment on that over the video, I'm afraid. So, but I would recommend that, again, if you want to get a second opinion from an electrophysiologist, they're always worthwhile. Just bear in mind also, sometimes the information seen online can be a lot to take in. And also at the same time, not only just a lot to take in, it's very hard because the decisions are made, every patient's unique, and there's a reason for a pacemaker. There's a reason for, a pacemaker that's a dual chamber or single chamber, or, where the settings are set as well on that pacemaker. So it's a really good opportunity, with things like this, to have a real thorough discussion with your cardiologist around the treatment options available moving forward.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
That's all right. You're welcome. Anyone else? I'm going to take a couple more questions and we'll finish up.
Yes, can you hear me? My name's Chris.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. How safe is it to do mild exercise like walking when you're feeling palpitations, as long as you're not breathless? Should that be
safe.
avoided?
Nope, safe. We would typically say, because, think of the logic. If you have permanent atrial fibrillation, you're always in a regular heart rhythm. So you're not going to do any mild physical activity is technically classed as doing chores around the house. So physical activity is any type of bodily movement. I'm only being technical, but physical activity and exercise are kind of two different terms. Physical activity is more of a bodily movement that we do things, say, around the house, or we just do once off just to achieve a certain outcome, where exercise is actually structured. It's actually, I'm going for a walk for 30 minutes because I want to improve my fitness levels, or whatever that may be the case. So there's a real distinct definition between physical activity and exercise. But physical activity with that type of thing is really driven by the patient and your symptoms. We would say that, okay, if you're having some palpitations or you're feeling palpitations, continue on with the exercise, see how it goes. If it settles down, if it's getting worse, or it's getting uncomfortable, if you're feeling dizzy or faint, definitely definitely back off with that. But we've had many patients that, that may feel some type of palpitations in their chest. Could be just because they're a bit anxious and have a bit of anxiety, and could be that over a period of time, with more and more exercise that they do, they become accustomed and they start to feel it a bit less. And so it was associated with a bit of anxiety around that. And then they start to improve in their self-reported symptoms. So I would never shy away. My area when it comes to exercise in patients with heart disease is quite the European model, and that is I'm quite aggressive. So, for me, I would always say go and do it unless you have serious symptoms that do not feel right and comfortable. Even me, I go running still, and my heart beats out of control, and I have chest pains, and it's a normal physiological response to exercise. So add heart disease, add someone who's a bit old and hasn't maybe done it for a long period of time, there's a bit of background anxiety to that too. So it's just about breaking that cycle a little bit and breaking that mold. But I would definitely recommend still partaking exercise. And if you're unable to walk, that's an issue. And I don't think that should be the case based on, I think that you would find that once you kind of start, if you're having some palpitations, keep persisting, if you're having that type of symptom persist, and see how it goes. And you may find it actually subsides. And over a period of time, you become more comfortable with the exercise or the walk that you're doing. As long as there's no other serious side effects, then I would always say continue on and persist, and monitor, of course.
Of course. I was thinking more of as soon as you feel palpitations, you shouldn't just sit down and lie in bed.
No, I would, and look, define palpitations, is it just a bit of a faster heart? Is it, because it's a response to exercise? Fitbits, watches these days and stuff are always great to help monitor your heart rate, so you can see how your heart rate's tracking. It also could be a normal increase in heart rate as a response to some of your exercise demands as well. You never know, right? Because your heart rate should go up with exercise. That's a healthy response. Yes. So all I would say is monitor, keep an eye on it. I always say, if the patient doesn't feel right, you don't feel right. We all kind of know. No. But I would say that if it feels comfortable, bearable, it's a walk, I would persist with it.
Yeah, because I've been going off for a mild walk and coming back, and then the people around me say, "Oh, you shouldn't have done anything. You should lie in bed."
Yeah, so. And that's the worst thing, and that just makes things worse for your long-term outcomes. So I've exercised people with atrial fibrillation. I've exercised with people in rapid atrial fibrillation, which is a higher heart rate when they shouldn't be, and they're okay. I mean, I'm not promoting that now, but what I'm saying is that people can exercise in AF, or people can exercise who have AF but are not in a regular heart rhythm at that time of exercise. So it's quite safe for your patient clientele.
Thank you very much.
I think I'll take one other question. There was someone with a hand up. So Debbie Timpano raised a hand, and also Tristan. I'll take those two and then I'm done.
Okay, thank you. That was very, very interesting. Thank you. Just a question on reversing AF. Mm-hmm. So if you're currently on medication which is keeping your heart rate down, how do you know if it's improving? Can you have AF while you're on medication? Or
yeah, you can. The medications, if you're you're talking like a rate control medication?
Yeah, beta blocker to keep it.
Yeah, beta blocker. A beta blocker, is also an antiarrhythmic in a way, but it's not targeting, it's controlling your atrial fibrillation, but it wouldn't technically be targeting the underlying source of the atrial fibrillation. Right. And so, being overweight, being obese, sleep apnea, hypertension, all these type of things, these are the actual sources of the atrial fibrillation in itself. And so, medication is very important and key, don't get me wrong, but we, in conjunction with the actual underlying causes of what's causing that arrhythmia in the first place, that would be we would always say the recommended strategy to go about it.
How can you tell if it's starting to reverse with increased exercise? dropping weight?
Technically, okay, so technically speaking, or how would you say AF is reversing? Well, you would class AF reversal that if you were to, a few things. I mean, if you were to, pick a timeline from January to December, and you would say, okay, last year I had 5 hours of AF, and this year I had 2 hours of AF.
Yeah.
You could say, okay, it's getting less. Your self-reported symptoms, have improved. So that's, it's getting better.
Right.
However, I go back to the imagery I showed before around, the scarred heart and the data there. We know that, medications, ablation therapies can help with the symptoms, help with the actual events of atrial fibrillation. So, you can have no AF, but underlyingly, because you're not doing the right thing, or, because the underlying sources are still there, it is just building up and building up and building up and building up until eventually it just tips over and you have an atrial fibrillation episode again.
Okay.
And so, ablations are good. Cardioversions are great. I've heard someone that's got 30, but at the end of the day, if you haven't actually, you're obese, you don't do any exercise, you did all the wrong things, you're not really targeting the source of it. These are just like throwing, rubbish there's rubbish on the floor and just putting the rug over the top to hide it. If you're not finding who's putting the rubbish on the floor, it's just going to pop out again.
Yeah.
And so it's really what we call we call it the integrated care approach now. It's a multidisciplinary team with the cardiologist, the nurse, and the allied health professionals to target all the risk factors to get the best outcomes for the patients.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Last question, Tristan, and we'll finish up.
All right, thank you very much. Apologies if I'm a bit out of breath. I'm actually on my daily walk.
That's okay, it's a good thing.
So points to me. Yes, thank you very much for doing this talk. It's been very informative, as we said, and it kind of mirrors my own journey with my own AF, which has been going on for the last couple of years. My sort of question is, okay, there's lots of sort of physical factors that contributes to the AF, and I'll admit one of my big ones is the overweight, which I am working on. But what about, has there been any sort of correlation with things like stress and cortisol and that sort of thing really affecting AF, or is it mainly down to the physical attributes?
Look, it's anecdotally, we have heard of this, about stress and the effect of stress and on the body. We know it can have a profound effect on things, but I'll say that anecdotally speaking. But when you look at the typical players of the game in terms of what causes atrial fibrillation, it's, age is a risk factor. Anyone over the age of 55, risk factor AF. Genetics, risk factor. Family history. Then you go, like I said, overweight, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, all the typical cardiovascular disease-based risk factors, lifestyle conditions. So there's a whole range of things that play. That really hasn't come in yet into it. But I have heard of anecdotally patients report that they've had nothing else and they've had a serious personal event in their life, and then afterwards they've had this, AF has kind of appeared. So can't discount it. I'm not saying it's not true. I definitely believe it is. But if you think about what do the numbers tell you, the numbers tell you that it's a lifestyle-based condition, and a condition now that we know in people over the age of 55, 1 in 3 have it, and if you go looking for it, you're more likely to find it.
Yeah. I think I was kind of lucky. I was 39 when I got diagnosed.
Okay, so you're quite young.
Look, and it's
there, and it's not a bad thing. The fact that you know about it, I always say to any of my patients who have heart disease, it's a good thing that you know. I mean, the fact that it's being treated, it's being medicated, you have pathways, you're reviewed, regularly from your physician. That's not a bad. It's actually a good thing. Better that you know than you don't know. AF is definitely a condition though that you can live with. if you're controlled for the stroke risk, depending, not everyone needs
Mhm.
anticoagulants. It depends, how regular you are in a regular rhythm. And also at the same time, the risk of developing heart failure, because you don't want to have obviously having higher heart rates can lead to, over a sustained period of time, can lead to development of heart failure. So if you're doing the right things, and AF is a condition that you can live just as a fulfilling life compared to someone without heart disease as well. So, and like I say with all my patients across the entire spectrum of heart disease, the more physically active you are, more exercise, and also the better you are in terms of getting on top of weight and those type of things, the better it's going to be long term, because it helps with symptoms, it helps with the disease progression, and actually we know all those things actually help with mortality benefits, so you're more likely to live longer as well. So it's a win-win, really.
Yeah, I guess mine's slightly different because I have been diagnosed with HCM as well. So I've got the underlying condition there as well, which appears to be on my dad's side. So they're sort of telling me that that's contributing slightly towards it, but obviously there's the other physical factors as well that's cropped in.
You sound like my close friend. He's got the same. So, and there could be a discussion on in the future around maybe an ICD or something like that, depending.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. So, but look, I hope that helps. But look, thank you, everyone, for today. I'm glad that you had the time to come and listen to our first Heart Support Connect for Heart Support Australia this year. As Chief Executive Officer, on behalf of Heart Support Australia, thank you for attending. We will look at doing this every 2 months moving forward. So you can follow us on our social media pages, our websites, and also our monthly mail outs that we now do electronically around what our next topic is. I'm in the pipelines now, still confirming that speaker, but I assure you will be someone much better than myself, that's for sure. So hopefully it's all good. But look, thank you again on behalf of Heart Support Australia, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.